PCB DTH में you can find this, that there are channels. For example, in VideoCon there is a channel, it's called Active DTH Active Rangmanch, it's called, yeah. DTH Active Rangmanch. You can watch theatrical performances on this channel. So this archiving has only recently started, so that a performance is not lost in time. But back then in 5th century BC, this archiving and recording was not done off stage art. One performance while performing was lost in time. It was lost in time. Do you get my point? Therefore, any critical evaluation that was supposed to be done of a performance had to be immediately done. And it was mostly based upon the memory of the one who is judging it, memory of the critique. It was based on the memory of the critique that these were recorded. The way he or she remembered, no, she was there, of course. The way they remembered a performance, or the way they remembered poems. Of course, poems had a written existence of literary poems. Poems were written, they were recorded. Performance, of course, it might have had, say, one copy out of which all the characters would learn their dialogues and perform their dialogues. And not everybody could have access to that copy, that one copy that was written by the writer of the play. So we do have access to Sophocles' poem. Like we said, epic poem. What's the name of the poem? Oedipus. But suppose Aristotle is writing about Oedipus. He's not talking about the literary form of Oedipus Rex. When he writes a criticism, he's not only telling you about the story, the plot that's there in the written form, but these critics were also critically evaluating performances. Like at best, we can talk about Plato. Plato is, of course, evaluating the performance because he tells you how a performance has a social and political impact. We'll deal with this in detail. This is why Plato says he doesn't want the youth of Greece to be misinformed, to be taken away from reality, and not be informed into metaphysical truth, but instead be moved by these theatrical performances. Because for him, these performances, these theatrical performances were imitations. The word he uses is mimesis. It's mimesis. Acting upon. It's acting. You are acting upon something, or you are trying to become something, which is not true. Say a character has to perform a tragic part, and he has to make sure that his viewers weep and cry over his situation. Like Oedipus. Oedipus falls in such a bad trap that when he is born, he is thrown out of the palace because the king is told that the same son will kill you. So in order to rid himself of repercussions of keeping and rearing Oedipus, what does the king do? Tiresias is the person who is the fortune teller of the time. Tiresias tells him that Oedipus will kill you. He tells the king, Oedipus is going to kill you. So what does the king do? He gets rid of Oedipus, gets him thrown away from the palace into a forest so that wild animals eat him up. But the person he sends, the servant who takes Oedipus, he does not uh, let him be in a forest, but in a safer place. Because of that, being in the safest of the place, safer places, he ties his feet up. He ties his feet, and the literal meaning of Oedipus is swollen feet. Because of that tying up, his feet are swollen. And the name means Oedipus means swollen feet. So why did king throw away Oedipus? Because he wanted to rid himself of what was written in fate, that he will be killed by Oedipus. So what happens? Story goes on. He is picked up by a, a family who doesn't have a childless family. He grows up and then goes back to that city where this king lives, and he still lives when Oedipus goes back. On his way, there happens to be a small fight, and Oedipus happens to kill the king. Now the king is dead. The story doesn't end here. When he is supposed to enter the city, because he only, while his travel into the city, on his way he kills the king. He has not reached the city yet. Now, for entering the city, he has to answer certain questions of the oracle. You know about the oracle, this doesn't need to be defined now. He has to answer certain questions of the oracle, and he succeeds in answering the questions, and this wins him the queen. The queen who is now also a widow. So who did Oedipus marry?
Mother.
His mother.
His mother. Oedipus doesn't know he has married his mother. Queen does not know he is marrying his son. But the audience knows the tragedy. While this performance is supposed to be done, the person playing the Oedipus has to make sure that the audience weeps and cries. What is the actor trying to do? He's trying to act. He's trying to be something. And also, he's trying to have a certain effect on people. He is trying to emotionally move the audience. And this is also the time, this Greek period, this is also the period when there was the faith in the dichotomy of body and soul. Their body was associated with lower and mean desires, whereas the soul aspired for something high. The soul aspired to reach for higher goals. The bodily desires were all carnal desires, also called carnal desires, bodily desires, also called corporeal desires, the desires of the body. And emotions were something associated with the body. Whereas for achieving these higher goals, these Greeks believed that you are supposed to make use of as much as you can of your mind and not your heart. The use of mind will help you be rational. But if you are being emotional over a performance, you are driven by your heart, driven by your emotions. These are just your carnal, corporeal desires that make you feel like that, and you are worshipping your body. So what does Plato say for this? Plato gives a solution that We must get rid of such poets who write such stuff. And we must only allow poets who help in enhancing and making better one's rationality, which is only possible if a writer or a poet is educated. If a writer is educated, only then will he make use of his soul. He will be rational, he will make use of his mind and try to achieve higher ends. Higher ends like all goodness that is there in the world. And if you are driven by things like performances, theatrical performance, they don't take you closer to metaphysical truths, but they take you closer to untruths, which is unreal. This is also a dichotomy, metaphysical truths versus untruth and unreal. Is it clear so far?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, in literature, we are still doing the literature where it begins, literary criticism where it begins. So it will not remain the same, it will change. For that, the socio-political background will also change. With the change in the socio-political background, criticism will change. It's always related, like it's related in literature. Literature is also affected by the social political reality. Same goes with the criticism. Like I said, in the present day world, we have a theory that's called anti-canon theory. But that's only with the socio-political changes, that we want the rights equally for Dalits. Like I said, this is introduced into Indian literature only after people started voicing against Dalit literature not being included in the canon. So anti-canon begins when you start voicing against all that has been done previously. Similarly, it was one of the effects of anti-canon theory that females started being included in all literatures, because before that, males were predominantly found in all canon. But now even females are included because this was after the anti-canon theory began. That one of the voices, some identities are being neglected. This is something that's happening in our day, neglection of certain identities, which resulted in anti-canon theory. Similarly, what all is happening in this era results in the criticism of their times. Do you get my point? This is why we give you the background of a place before we move into the criticism of that time. So this is why also we are doing the political background, the historical background of Greece in this period. Now, coming back to what we were discussing, the questions that the critics of this age raised were questions that are still dominant in criticism. Even now, we pose such questions. The answers are different, though. The questions remain the same, almost the same, not always the same. The questions were like, what are fictional representations? Now, so far, I have only told you about Plato, but there are others who will criticize Plato. They also become critics. So they will tell you what they like or what they do not like in Plato. So they also become critics. So they tell you about what makes a fictional representation. What is a fictional representation? अब ये सवाल क्यों उठता है? We all know what fictional representation is. Then why the question at all? I keep giving you the example of new fictional representations that keep coming up. What was one of the recent fictional representation I told you about that recently came up? And therefore, the question needs to be revisited in each era. There was art in this time. Fictional representation was theater, poetry, songs sung by rhapsodes. Songs sung by rhapsodes. Painters were there. So this was the kind of art that was available to people in that age. And they might have known about painting only some kinds of paintings. There are so many types of paintings nowadays that we have now. Leave that aside. Uh, of course, there were sculptures also, but not as a fictional representation. They would only make sculptures of philosophers, of gods. But then later on, it became an art form. It became an art form because sculptures started representing a fictional reality. A fictional reality was created out of stones and rocks and metals. So this is why this question keeps critics keep on revisiting the question: what makes fictional representation? So I was asking you, what is one of the questions? What is one of the recent fictional representation that wasn't there and therefore wasn't studied before? I'll give you one from an age from 20th century. This is a graphic novel. So when a new genre gets added into fictional representation, which also means that critics will have to expand their scope of what they call fictional representation. And then I told you, sand art is something new. Sand art. Artists
Illustration art.
create stories out of sand, illustrate out of sand using sand. Then there are many artists who work at the beaches and create art out of the sand at the beaches. Have you seen any art form that was created near the beaches, on the shores of the beaches?
Yes, ma'am.
If you haven't, find this out. So this is why critics keep on visiting the question of fictional representation. Now, second thing they question is about relation of fictional representation to the real world. What does it do to the real world? How does it affect the real world? Does it help? Does it worsen the situation or does it help? Examples of this are after the World War, obviously the people in power would never have thought about the repercussions of war unless and until it was fictionally represented for them. It was shown to them that real world is really having bad effects. Or in the present day, unless and until people started writing about the effects globalization and capitalism is having on environment, that ecological studies would not have started. Ecological studies start only after people start creating it in fiction, critics start evaluating it, liking or disliking it, endorsing it, and this is how they also talk about its relation with the real world. Plato will also talk about relation of art or literature to the real world, and he will not like it. Liking and disliking is a different thing, but it becomes critical evaluation when you talk about this relation. The other questions, I quickly go through the other questions that critics deal with are relation between fiction and truth. I'll not write this down on board, you write this down in your notebooks. Relation between fiction and truth. Reception of art. Reception means how a viewer or audience or a reader receives art. Reception of art is also something studied by critics. Canonization, discussed already. Technical and aesthetic terms of good literature, which means it defines what constitutes, what is required of good literature, and what this can also be simplified into standardization of good art. Then you also deal with social and political contexts of judgment, like we are doing right now. What are the contexts in which these judgments are passed by critics? This is not simple judgments that you have in courts, but they are called critical judgments. And then, what is the ideological background in which any critical evaluation is done? Like we'll do about the ideological background of Plato, despite the fact that Plato is the teacher of
Aristotle.
Who is the teacher of Plato?
Socrates.
Socrates. So yes, so despite the fact that they do belong to almost the same time, Socrates and Plato belong to the same time, and they also are similar in their thought. But Plato and Aristotle, despite belonging to the same time, Aristotle is totally opposite of what Plato has been talking about art. Aristotle has a totally different opinion about art. So what is the ideological background of the two people that they differ in what they talk about? Clear?
Yes,
So
ma'am.
what I was telling you right now, this had nothing to do with Greece. What I said from here, point number one, this was generally about what we do in criticism. This had nothing to do with the time. This was a general features of criticism. What does criticism generally do? Literary criticism. Any questions? Anything you want me to explain? Okay. People who have done Ion, can you tell me how does this help so far? Which part of these lectures has helped you understand Ion better?
The Socratic method. मतलब we didn't know that it was called Socratic method. मुझे लगा यही ऐसी बात करते हैं तो यही होगा. And हाँ मतलब यूनिवर्सिटी के लेक्चर्स में ऐसा कुछ डिस्कस नहीं हुआ था. There was just one thing, what is criticism, and वही exaggerate करके उसके बाद सीधा प्लेटो. तो it helped.
So far, okay, you know nothing about what Plato had to say about art, do you? Was there any
No, ma'am, I don't think so.
So Plato was against art. Plato was against performances. Can you tell me why is Ion written in that method? It appears like a performance. Socrates is a character in his work, right? In Ion. Socrates is having a
Yes,
dialogue with
ma'am.
a rhapsode. Isn't that a performance?
अगर हम देखेंगे ड्रामेटिकली मतलब इसको हम कह सकते हैं ना कि डायलॉग्स अपने बोलते हैं वैसे अगर हम इसको एज अ परफॉर्मेंस लेंगे लेकिन आई
Right.
डोंट
So
नो
isn't
maybe
it mimesis? Isn't it acting? Isn't it becoming the same that he rejects?
in a way it is but
So this is how you have to keep your eyes and ears open and critically evaluate. You cannot be passive readers, just read the story and this is what Plato has to say and we learn and we know the summary of Ion. No, look at it critically. He rejects performances, he rejects acting, becoming, mimesis, and this is the same thing that he does in his text. Even Socratic method is a kind of a performance. Two having a dialogue, and you don't see nowhere, the voice doesn't come from the person named Plato. So if Plato's voice is nowhere, the voice that you have in the text is of somebody, and that somebody has to be created. Wasn't that unreal? The dead Socrates talking to some rhapsode? But
yes ma'am.
he allows certain poets to live. These are the poets who are educated, who can philosophize and are philosophers, who know about higher thinking and can go beyond what their bodies need. They serve the soul by their rational thinking. And this is what he is doing in all the texts that he is writing. Is it clear?
Yes, ma'am.
So, shall we end the lecture here?
Ma'am, for me, this is sort of like a new thing. Like I'm trying to grab it because I have never read this, and this is totally new for me. Can you please
Everybody is
suggest?
new except for one student, Mehak. All of you are new to literary criticism.
I mean that for them, this is a type of like they have to read this, and then universities they do read it. I mean to say that. So can
फिलहाल
you
इनका
suggest us
semester
something like sort of like you for modernism, you gave us some readings for this, and which helped us understand it easily.
for now start
So
reading Ayan. Start reading Ayan.